4 kings in a row without an heir, that's a succession crisis. The media has bombarded us with stories of ancient aliens building pyramids, crystal skulls, the Ark of the Covenant being in a church in Ethiopia, and Pharaoh's cherubims at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba.
All right, welcome you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. We have David Falk, Dr. David Falk, Egyptologist and Bible scholar. I want to thank you guys so much for just checking this out. And I've got a couple announcements before we get started. Next week, Wednesday afternoon, I believe, I'm having on Dr. Vince Bontu to talk about Christianity and race a little bit. It's going to be, is Christianity a white man's religion? Because he's a professor that kind of talks about these issues, and so we're going to have him on. May 22nd, I'm having on Dr. Kurt McGregor to have an in-depth on Molinism. We're going to talk about theology, some Calvinism, some Molinism, and Arminianism, and kind of go through the whole gambit. So anyway, that'll be cool. And then in June, Dr. Michael Heiser will be on. And so we're going to be, we've got various things we're going to talk about to Heiser about. So, but anyway, let's get started. Dr. David Falk, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Today I want to talk about, number one, I want to talk about the Exodus a little bit, but I mostly want to focus on your book, The Ark of the Covenant. So I have actually read the book so far. I got an advance, I just
great start.
To get a copy, so I could, I wanted to make sure that, I knew before we got in, because you can be confused and bogged down in so many details. It's not going to hurt though either that I've watched probably all of your videos, so I just made sure I was ready. So with that being said, first, why don't you open by just telling us about yourself, your background, maybe your formative years. How did you get interested in, where are you from? How did you get interested in the Bible and Egyptology?
Okay. Well, I'm born and raised in Vancouver, Canada. I am a Canadian. I basically grew up on Saturday morning specials of ancient Egypt and King Tut. So I had that real interest in Egypt as a child. After, when I grew up, I went to university, held a computer IT job for a while, and then I went back to grad school. And I really wasn't looking to get into the Exodus per se. I was actually much more interested in other Egyptology topics, like scribal traditions. Scribal traditions really sort of fascinated me. And it wasn't until my third master's degree that I was confronted with the Exodus, and I had to, at that point, deal with the evidence, what was there, what wasn't there, weigh the evidence to see how good it was. And then sort of after I had started to look at that stuff, I actually went to the University of Liverpool to do my PhD in Egyptology, where I was the research assistant of Kenneth Kitchen.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So that's what I was actually, before you go on, I was going to read out your bio that I had. It's that you received your PhD from the University of Liverpool in Egyptology. Mm-hmm. Wrote a dissertation entitled Ritual Professional Furniture, which I'm sure had a huge influence on this book.
Oh, yes, it did. Well, that was the context study. You see, I did a very traditional Egyptology dissertation, but that was sort of the background material I needed to write this book.
Right. That was kind of like the precursor to this.
It was the precursor. It was the heavy lifting. The dissertation was the heavy lifting to create this book.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a lot about the ritual processional furniture today, mm-hmm. And but you also hold 3 master's degrees, an MDiv, degree, an MA in Near Eastern and Biblical Archaeology, and languages from Trinity International University, and a third master's degree from in Near East Middle Eastern Civilizations from the University of Toronto, and a BA in philosophy from University of British Columbia. So with that being said, we know where you grew up. We know that you grew up watching the Tut on TV, and that kind of influenced you. And
that Doctor Who.
Yeah. Oh, okay, Doctor Who. So let's talk about your academic career. It looks like you spent time in the Egyptian side of scholarship as well as the theological side, and travel, teaching. Tell us about your journey a little bit, authorship. Tell us a little bit about that before we jump into the meat.
Okay. Well, I was first published in 2013, where I did some articles as a grad student, as a PhD student. I also published my first book at that time, too, which was actually on Gnosticism, the Egyptian roots of Gnosticism.
I've seen that.
It's an expensive little volume.
I looked it up. I was like, because I'm super interested in that. So I was like, I'll just buy them both together. And then I looked and I'm like, $77.
Yeah, I don't even own a copy of that one. It's beyond my ability to afford.
Well, that's all. I'm definitely going to get it because I've noticed some myself. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But go ahead. Okay. Sorry.
So after I did my dissertation, I then started. I taught a little. I was an adjunct at the University of British Columbia for a while, and then I sort of struck out and did my own independent research. At the moment, I'm actually affiliated with the Vancouver School of Theology, where I'm a research associate.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's where you currently.
That's where I currently am.
Okay. So I guess to get started here, let's start with something I found very interesting. So not in the book, but in one of your talks, you said that let's start with dating, because we want to get to the Exodus first before I go into the book, okay? Partially go into the book because there's a little bit about Exodus in the book, right? But let's start with dating. You talk about dating Abraham and Amraphel of Shinar.
Of Shinar, yes.
Yes, and that he is most likely Hammurabi of Babylon. Can you explain a little bit of why we would think that, and then how that helps us to date Abraham?
Okay. Well, the fact is we've got the complete kings list for Babylon. Now, scholars are pretty much agreed that Shinar is Babylon. Okay, so they're pretty much agreed across the board on that. As far as the Amraphel component, it's the way that the Hebrew transliterates Hammurabi. Okay, so Hammurabi actually comes from an Amoritic name called Amurapi. So you start off with a guttural, you have an M, an R, a P. So your first four letters are an exact match with Amraphel in the Hebrew. It's the only king in the Babylonian kings list that's a close match. So you're pretty much, if you believe that this is a match, then you're sort of forced into that synchronism. Okay, and a synchronism is just a way of saying that we have a piece of data that connects two people to being contemporary. Now, we're also lucky in the respect that Hammurabi was a king that wrote a lot of correspondence, had a lot of interaction with other kings in the ancient Near East, such as Rin-Sim of Larsa, the kings of Mari, the kings of Syria. So what we have with Hammurabi is it's not so much that Abraham is highly dateable, but it's that Hammurabi is highly dateable.
Right.
And because Hammurabi is highly dateable, we can also date Abraham as well.
Gotcha. From the synchronism.
From the synchronism, yeah.
Right. Exactly. So, so in getting prepared for this, because I want to talk to you really before I even read the book, my thing was like, I'm going to be I'm working on a series for beginners on how to read the Bible. And I ran into the same problem you did when you said that you started your Exodus series and you're like, I was just going to do 6 little parts, but those easily multiplied into 9 and then on and on. I just kept, it's so hard, right?
It is hard. Because the deeper you get into the data, the more you find. This is one of the really exciting things about Egyptology for biblical studies, is the deeper you go, the more you see.
That's true. And I mean, I'll tell you honestly, my wife, whenever I have 20 books stacked up and they're all of different things, like I've got Calvin's commentary on Isaiah, and then all these different things that are not even related, and she's just like, she doesn't understand it. I guess we should probably say thanks to your wife, Kiara, for backing you up. I know you put in the front of the book that she really was there for you.
Yes, she was.
Everything. So let's just
couldn't have done it without her.
Okay, so I thought maybe I'd just shout out her first, and then so let's talk about the Exodus. And
sure,
part of the reason why there's so much buzz around you at the moment is because you did a review of Inspiring Philosophy, his new Exodus video, and I don't really want to harp on IP's faults because we've seen your response, and we've seen that IP did a fantastic job. When he talked to you, he was just like, you know what, you're right. And after all the production and the probably money and time he put into it, he was just like, if it's not right, it's not right. And I have a video on my channel called Things I Was Wrong About, and I quoted one church father when it was another, and so
we all make mistakes.
Exactly.
I mean, I made a mistake today on my the interview I did just this morning. He asked me about the Bronze Age, and I gave the wrong dates. I tried to do that off the top of my head, and it was just like, well, okay, I misremembered it.
It happens.
Yeah, it happens. So, we all make mistakes. The question is, do we own up to our mistakes? And I think it's very important for everybody, not just YouTubers, but for scholars to own up to their mistakes. Say, okay, I'm a fallible human being. I'll make mistakes. I'll probably make some mistakes in this video, and that's just the way it is. You're not perfect.
It's going to happen for sure. And and so with that being said, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk in general about this documentary, what it was trying to accomplish, and others like it, because you've also done reviews of the sorry, I'm blanking, Exodus.
The Patterns of Evidence films?
Patterns of Evidence, right?
Yeah, that was what I was most famous for prior to this.
So can you explain for people who are brand new to the subject, what is the early and late date, and why is the early date attractive to Christians?
Okay. The early date defines the Exodus in 2 ways. It defines it as being a date, usually around 1446. And it's basically, it takes the date for Solomon's temple and adds the 480 years from 1 Kings 6:1. Now that's half the definition. The other half is who was king at the time, which was Amenhotep II. Now, with the late date of the Exodus, it happens roughly around 1250, 1260 BC, and the king at that time was Ramses II. Okay. Now, there's 2 reasons why the early date is so popular among Christians. The first is it does read that 1 Kings 6:1 in a very wooden, literal fashion. And in many ways, this has become sort of a shibboleth test of saying, who's, reading the Bible literally.
Right.
The second reason it's very popular is because for the last 50 years, there's been a lot of these sort of grassroots missionaries that have gone from church to church, basically saying, if you really believe in the Bible, you will believe in this reading.
You know what's so funny? I hear that in debates, and John Walton. I'm a fan of John Walton, and I like reading his material. And I've seen people take his view against the young Earth creationists about the flood and other things like this being a local flood and so on. And they say, and I've heard this in a debate. Is that, well, listen, if he wants to call the text a liar, then he can do that. But I'm going to go with what the text says. And the whole thing is that they're both looking at what the text says.
Yeah.
It's about literalistic reading, or what it literally is trying to convey, right? And so,
well, it's also a rejection of the grammatical historical method that has been the mainstay of Protestant Christianity for 300 years. The grammatical historical method has basically said, when you approach the biblical text, you have to take it in its genre, in its context, both historical and grammatical context, and then derive your interpretation from that.
That's right. And so I noticed in the book, because you're mentioning that, on page 11, you have the Exodus date as a section in the first chapter, and you say
yes, that my publisher made me do that.
Okay, gotcha. So I like it though.
It was a very unusual situation because most of the time publishers don't actually want me to talk about this because it's often bad for sales.
Oh, gotcha. Well,
so most of the time I get publishers saying, well, we'll let you talk about the Exodus, just don't talk about a date. Well, what happened was this publisher said, well, we don't even want you to talk about the kings. Well, how can you do a book on Egyptology without naming the names of kings? So I said, okay, I got to talk about the names of kings. Otherwise, this has no credibility at all. And they said, well, okay, you can talk about the names of the kings, but you got to have this big section on the Exodus. Like, okay.
Yeah. So that is interesting. I'm glad you gave us some background on that, because I love to hear those little insights about like when you're trying to put out the book. And so you on, actually, I'm going to go back to page 11, but on page 14, you say the early date is often misidentified as the traditional date, although its view is a little over 100 years old. And the first suggestion of this notion was in 1906.
Yes.
And that the late date goes all the way back to late antiquity with Rabbi Hillel. Yeah. So do you see that a lot in when there's disagreements about people trying to use problematic terms like traditional date and things like that? Absolutely.
It is a problematic term. And the reason why it's so problematic is because we have we're temporally challenged in our view of history. We kind of see tradition as something that's always been there. And oftentimes a tradition can be very, very young. I've seen things accepted as a tradition that are as young as 15 years. 15 years goes by and now it's a tradition. Well, right. What kind of tradition is that? And the fact is that many of the traditions, even what we hold and say, our biblical views, our biblical traditions are really quite young. So we have to sort of say, okay, we'll trace our traditions back. Where did they come from? How old are they? A tradition is a bad reason to believe anything anyway. It's not a great reason to believe anything at all. We held it in high esteem because of, say, the tradition of the apostolic faith that's once for all given to the saints. But a lot of what we accept as tradition is outside of, say, the apostolic sees.
Gotcha. And so we do know, you said, well, because of the victory stela and where Israel is mentioned
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's probably the only mention that we have of the actual name Israel, right?
It is.
And so,
Yeah.
because of that, we can derive that the Israelites arrived in Canaan no later than the 15th regional year of Merneptah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, because they're
Yeah, the
mentioned
fifth
in
regular
the,
year. Yeah.
of the poetic section of that,
Yes.
along with Hittites and the other groups. So, with that, you also mentioned that the early day was kind of popularized a little bit by the Schofield Reference Bible.
Only by its association, yes.
Gotcha. Because I'll tell you, in doing some of the research I did for this biblical making it easy to read the Bible series for beginners that I'm working on now, when studying the gap theory, because I'm looking at interpretations for Genesis, and it also said very highly promoted in a lot of the Schofield Reference Bibles in the beginning.
Yes.
So that kind of not poison the well, but it kind of gave that as a hint towards some of their readers.
Schofield meant well.
Sure.
But it was also, in many respects, the first study Bible out there. So because many of, say, American evangelicals and fundamentalists had never encountered a study Bible before, many of them took the materials inside that Schofield Bible and gave it the same sort of authority that the biblical text itself has.
Yeah, and so
and what Schofield did was he used Ussher's chronology, which takes a completely different approach to the Exodus date than the early daters do.
Yeah, that's what you say is that because it included a version of Ussher's chronology, it inadvertently popularized this date.
Yeah,
the early date. So
yes.
I get that you said inadvertently. I want to make sure I was clear about that. But
yeah, the two dates are actually separated by 50 years. They're different by 50 years.
Sure.
But that's because the two views are actually starting from different beginning points. The early date starts from Solomon's temple. Ussher starting from his accepted date of creation.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you laid out some challenges to the early date. One of which being, even if the name Ramses was mentioned in the 15th century, for currently there is no evidence for it. The actual city of Ramses didn't exist before the 13th century.
That is correct.
And so that kind of provides a little bit of evidence against the other view.
Yeah. The earliest remains we find at the site of Paramses dates to Seti I, which is Ramses II's father. And that happens to be a royal residence. But sort of the big sea change in the 19th dynasty happens with the reign of Ramses II, where he moves the capital of Egypt from Thebes all the way down to Paramses.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to get into that because that's going to be another part that really lends toward the later date. Is the moving of the capital. But before that, though, another thing that you mentioned is that in the Amarna letters, we kind of got a view or a window into Levantine politics.
Yes.
And so with that, it exposed kind of this conflict between a rigid reading of 1 Kings 6:1 with the story about Joshua in Judges 2:8, I believe. And so it says basically that with the Israelite conquest, Joshua 11:11 says that Joshua destroyed Hazor with fire. And if Joshua must have been at least 13 years by the time he was a spy, he went to spy in Canaan in Numbers 13, and Joshua lived to 110, as might be suggested from a literal reading of Judges 2:8, then he died no later than 1349 BC. The problem is that Tirshi, the king of Hazor, ruled well into the reign of Akhenaten, which is 1351 to 1335. So that kind of really lends credibility to the late date.
It does. Israel Finkelstein, in his book The Bible and Earth, he's basically one of his big arguments, say against the a biblical exodus, is that we don't find the Israelites in Israel during the period of the Amarna letters. Now, he makes a very, very interesting statement just 2 pages later where he says, well, given this early date of the Exodus, we don't find any evidence of an Exodus. If there were an Exodus, it would have to be in the Ramesside period.
Yeah,
it's an amazing admission.
Yeah.
But people stop there and they get to there and they stop reading.
Yeah. Yeah, my friend that you were on Sentinel Apologetics channel the other day, I've heard him. He debated a guy a while back, and he mentioned Finkelstein, and so I haven't really read too much of his work, but I just know some of his quotes from my buddy Rob, but who's here as well in the chat. But let me just get back to the the point that you're making about the capital being moved, because an additional problem with the Exodus, as you say on page 16, is that the capital of early Dynasty 18, 1538 to 1305 BC, was located at Thebes in Upper Egypt, over 300 miles from the Asiatic settlement of Goshen of Varus. Now, for people who are just brand new, the story tells us that when Joseph became the vizier in Egypt, that the Pharaoh said that he would give the best part of the land to Joseph's family when they came, and he put them in the biblical story in Goshen, which is Varus. And before we get to the actual moving of the capital and all, and why that's evidence, you had a really good insight about Goshen being the best part of the land, and why you've been there, and kind of tell us a little about how that makes sense with today's viewing.
Okay. Well, first of all, Varus was the capital of the Hyksos. Okay, so during that 15th dynasty period, that was the capital of Egypt for the Hyksos. So that's where Joseph would have been anyway as vizier. So he's right smack dab there in Avaris. Now you go to Tel Daba today, Kantir, this site, and you actually, when I actually went out there and I took photographs, I was like wading through the fields, and there's crops up to your neck. It's verdant green everywhere. Which, after coming from, say, Abu Simbel and seeing nothing but desert, is a stark contrast. You go to Thebes, you just see desert, unless you're in like the agricultural plains. But even the agricultural plains have nothing of the verdancy that you see at, say, Kantir and Tel Daba. It's just massive, massive fields, and it's still today one of the most fertile regions in Egypt.
Yeah, so it kind of correlates with the story that when Pharaoh said that he would give Joseph's family the best portion of the land, that it's still today, as compared to some of these more desolate regions, is this area of fields and fertility, I guess you could say.
The other thing Joseph says is he gives them Joseph so he can be near to his kin. Okay, so it has to be in a location that's in close proximity to the capital where Joseph is working.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, and so that's what gets us back to the capital move, because on the early view, the capital was in Thebes in Upper Egypt at that time, over 300 miles away. So the story of Moses waking up and going to visit Pharaoh whenever Pharaoh calls for him because he gets a plague or whatever, then he's got to travel 300 miles of distance. And it's like every day he's got to wake up and do this thing, or presumably soon,
a week goes by and he's back in Lower Egypt, and then take another week trip and go back to the.
Now, we're putting aside the fact there could have been helicopters back then, right?
Yeah, putting aside the helicopter theory, yes, it's the alien spacecraft.
I was about to say the ancient aliens actually might have had a point then. You know?
They had a taxi service between Thebes and Avaris. Yeah.
Right. So it makes a lot more sense that when the capital moved to, it moved closer to Avaris, 2 kilometers, right, from Avaris at Pyramses?
Pyramses.
Sorry if I.
It literally means Pyramses literally means house of Ramses.
Sure.
And if you look at it, we find this name in the Egyptian texts. So the city is mentioned frequently in Egyptian text as Per Usur Ma'are Setepen Re. So literally, the house of Ramses II.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's interesting. So let me ask you this real quick because it just caught my attention in the chat. I was trying not to look at the chat because I get distracted. If you guys want to hold your questions to the end and tag me, like I will definitely get to them if as long as he's got enough time for that in the end. But we did get a question in the side chat. I've seen that S.J. Thomason, because we've already kind of covered this a little bit, but she asked, do Dr. Falk's ideas correspond at all with the patterns of evidence ideas? S.J., I think right before you came in here, I mentioned that he's done a series showing that the patterns of evidence series, kind of debunking it or like showing the inaccuracies in that. And so they do not correspond. The patterns of evidence documentary and the I think it's called Exodus Reloaded or something like that IP
there's 3 of them now.
Okay, those take this early day and they're trying to push back, and that's what we're getting to in this next part. Because the capital moved, it makes it tremendously more likely that it was during this time where the capital was 2 kilometers away instead of 300 miles away when Moses was going to visit the Exodus. Moses was going to visit the Pharaoh. And then let's get to the 480 calendar years of 1 Kings 6:1. So you bring up in the book the one meaning fallacy.
Yes.
And you reference a book that you think is a good book by Grant Osborne called the Hermeneutical Spiral. So just tell us a little bit about that, ascending and descending numbers, and how the one meaning before we get into the descending and ascending numbers, first the one meaning fallacy and kind of how that plays into this verse.
Okay. The one meaning fallacy, as also mentioned by D.A. Carson in his exegetical fallacies too, which is the idea that any particular reading of the Bible has one and only one possible meaning. Okay? So basically what you're doing with a biblical text is you're stripping it of all its context, and you're taking the one meaning and you're applying that to all situations. So a lot of, say, early date advocates say when you have a number that relates to a date, it always should be read as a literal date, a literal count of years. Most often they're Julian years, which has its own problems.
Right. And so with that, it's not just years, though. There are numbers in the Bible that are known to be symbolic or idyllic. Right, like the for people who haven't really thought about or heard about the idyllic numbers, let's talk about 7 and 40 and things like this. You mentioned you mentioned in the book in the same chapter that numbers like 40 and 12 and multiples thereof, this would help us to understand the 1 Kings 6:1 passage, because the 480 years is just 40 times 12, right? Is that
yes?
Okay.
Well, here's the thing. The 1 Kings 6:1 passage, again, like every other text, when we take a historical grammatical approach, is the first thing we have to do is determine the genre. Okay? That's the first thing we need to do with any text, is determine the genre. The genre of 1 Kings 6:1 is that it is a temple dedication inscription. And we find these in various contexts all across the ancient Near East. Like, for example, the temple dedication of Tukulti-Ninurta I of the Temple of Ishtar. You know, he says that 720 years have elapsed since the foundation of that temple. Well, it wasn't an exact count of 720. What it was numerology. It's 60, which is very, very important in Mesopotamian mathematics, because you have a base 60 method of mathematics. And then times that by 12, and that's how we got the 720.
Right, exactly. So there's a lot of overlap there, because I've understood this idea from reading Heiser, because he talks about the base 60 or sexagesimal system of the Assyrian mathematics. And so basically what you're saying is that we're looking at things in our modern context, which gives us 480 years is actually, each one is like a year to us, basically. And rather, there are these idyllic numbers that are used. Like, for example, the 40 days is used so much. 40 days and 40 nights. The boat on the ark, you had 40 days and 40 nights, but then it gives a different reading of the actual total days on the ark, right? And then you get into Moses and the 40 days on the mountain. Then you get the 40 years in the wilderness. You get all these 40s everywhere, and it's not, those numbers are not necessarily saying this is exactly the 40 days or 40 years. It's saying approximately, or ideally.
Like, for example, Moses his lifespan has been broken down into 3 groups of 40.
Right, okay.
He leaves Egypt, he flees from Egypt, and spends and returns after 40 years. He spends 40 years in Egypt, and then he leaves and then spends 40 years in the wilderness. Then he comes back, and then is the Israelite wandering for 40 years. So he's 80 years old. When he puts his 2 full-grown sons and his aged wife on a donkey. When he comes back after 80 years.
Right. Yeah. So
you can see how that sort of starts to sound a little odd.
Makes you question, right?
It makes you question.
So it's
poor donkey.
It seems like, a lot of so I've heard people say that Matthew is doing the same thing with his genealogy and we're going to get into genealogy in a minute, because I definitely want to talk about that. But it seems like some people are saying that, hey, Matthew's doing something like that with his genealogy because it's different from Luke's, and Matthew's using these 14s, I believe it is.
Yeah, and the gematria.
Yeah, like
14
exactly.
generations. 3 groups of 14 generations.
And then, and we see that similar thing, like we see long ages in the Old Testament, like people will live, 600 years or something, right, in Genesis. But then you get these long years, and then I forget how long Abraham's father lived, but then it says Abraham, when he was 100 years old, he was like, "What? Can I have a child when I'm 100?" And it's like, well, yeah, these guys are having them at 200 or 300 years old or something, like it just shows you that the context isn't that these are literal ages, that people are living 600-700 years or something like that, right?
Well, the problem is we don't know what the context is. We're having to discover the context after 3,000 years. Our ancestors did not question the context of the Bible. They just more or less accepted it. Now we understand that if we're going to read this for our context in our day and age, we have to understand what that original context was, so we understand the text as it was given at that time.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good point, because I was going to ask you, what do you say when people just go, you know what, you've just been too schooled and you have too much of this scholarship mentality. If you just read the original King James version that Paul had, you would get it.
The original King James version Paul had.
So the point is that a lot of the evidence that we have is more recent, right?
Yes.
Because of archaeology and things like this. And if we find, like, for example, what you mentioned, the Syrian king, is it Tukulti?
Tukulti Ninurta, the first.
Okay. And he said 720 years had elapsed between his own reconstruction of the temple of Ishtar and its foundation by the other king,
Elishua, yeah.
Yes, and the number 720 approximates the distant past using 12 multiplied by 6, which corresponds to the Assyrian sexagesimal system of mathematics. So, all that being said, if we didn't have that context of that, we couldn't necessarily look at this 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1.
Yeah.
But given that, this puts it in perspective for the date of the Exodus. It kind of gives us that. It kind of gives us that context to understand that what's happening here.
Now, it's very interesting that that sort of 480 years was never actually used to try to date the Exodus until 1906. So even Jewish historians knew that it had a significance that wasn't necessarily a chronological significance.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good point that you make. Like, it goes back Rabbi Hillel, and then it's like, if this was the thought of date, or what people were reasoning would probably be the date, why wasn't it really produced as a theory until 1906?
Right?
Right?
Well, you look at sort of the debates of, say, the mid 19th century, where you had, like Christians and Jews sort of chiming in on the date of the Exodus because of Lepsius's work on this, and they're all coming up with 13th century dates.
Gotcha.
Even back then, and they'll say, Jewish tradition says that, hey, it's like 1342 or something like that. They're not coming up with 15th century dates there, because they're not using 1 Kings 6:1 in that way.
Right. They're being a little, yeah. So that kind of shows that where they were at as far as their thinking, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so what I want to do now is, let me pull up this picture, this map, because I want to get to the next part I want to get to the next part in the book that I thought was very interesting about the actual path that was taken in the Exodus, like the route that was taken, and some of the things that people may not understand as far as why this route was taken the way it was.
Sure.
So let me pull up this picture here, and if you want to say a few things before while I'm pulling this up about the Israelites, when they escaped, they could have taken a shorter route to Canaan, right? But instead, they avoided this place called this route called the Way of Horus. Do you want to kind of explain that to us?
Okay, the Way of Horus was a military road across the North Sinai. It hugged the coast of the Mediterranean. It was heavily fortified. There was many Egyptian forts up there, and we find a map of these forts at Karnak Temple. So this is one of the first attestations we have of, say, extra biblical attestations of, say, Migdol. That fortress is attested at both Karnak and Medina Habu. Okay. So there was a set of military forts that extended from Charu all the way to the Philistine Pentapolis.
Okay, so let me see if I can. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to pull this up or not. But so basically, there are two routes that they could have taken, right?
Yeah.
But
two common routes.
The reason why they didn't want to take the first route, which is called the Way of Horus, is because it was heavily fortified, and it would have led them into these major Philistine cities where they would have encountered Egyptian and Philistine military there.
Yes.
And they would have to face that opposition. So that would have been, yeah. And so they kind of did the smarter thing, right, by trying to avoid that. But there's another route. Right. There's another route called the Way of Shur. But you say in the book that the reason why that wasn't desirable is because it lacked water, and it was infamous for that.
The Way of Shur was often used by caravan traders. And we actually find it referenced in Genesis. When Hagar tries to make her way back to Egypt, she takes the Way of Shur.
Okay.
And the first thing she runs across is there's no water out there. One of the things that the caravanners did, though, was they stocked up on water before they went on their journey. So why the caravan traders would take this was it avoided the military checkpoints.
Okay.
If you avoided the military checkpoints, you didn't have to pay as much graft. So you could avoid, say, paying off officials by just taking this route across the Sinai. It wasn't militarily patrolled. It was pretty quick if you knew your way through it, but it lacked water. There were no wells. So you ended up in trouble pretty fast if you didn't stock up on water before you went.
Okay, so I think I have it shared here. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so here's a Varus up here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And this path, this red path here, is showing where they actually went, right?
Yep.
And on their way to Mount Sinai, which is down here. And this is in the book, of course. So, like, I highly suggest you guys to get the book, because it's not just a good reference material with all original photography, right, by yourself.
Yep, most of it is original.
Okay, so it's got some great pictures in it, and of course it has maps and things like this that are really going to help you when you're thinking about this. But you can see how they kind of made a loop here and came all the way down around this Gulf of Suez into the Mount Sinai region. And you can see here the blue line on the bottom is the way of Shur, but it's where water is very very rare. And then the top, way of Horus, which is a problem with it, is the land of the Philistines in the military city. So just wanted to kind of share that real quick to give people context about what we're exactly talking about there. So any other comments on that before we get started on the next part?
Absolutely. They did what was not expected, which was that they could have gone just directly south once they had hit the Wadi, exited the Wadi Tumilat. And that would have made the most sense. But what they did was they went north and sort of wandered around the military, were at the outskirts of these certain military establishments like Migdol, Baal Safan, Pihahi Road. And those particular towns would send reports back to Paramses.
Right. And so
the Israelites were baiting, or God was baiting the Egyptians to come after them.
Right. Okay. To expend those resources.
Mm-hmm.
And what you say in the book is that really what Israel was doing was kind of hopping from oasis to oasis on their journey.
Yes.
Trying to, as you might travel in the wilderness, is going to the spots of water. Like if you're watching any survival shows, like their first thing is like, all right, we got to get to where some water is, Yeah. And then they set up camp not far from there. So yeah, I can understand exactly. The other thing is that when we're looking at this in context, because one of the things I'm going to do a separate part in this series about teaching people how to read the Bible for beginners. I'm going to do a separate part about context, and then one on hermeneutic, interpretation, and then one about translations, things like that. But with context, I was going to ask you about it, and I just realized, like, the book is really about context.
It is.
Yeah, you even say in one part of the book something like, the reason for the book is just to contextualize, where they're coming from and how this makes sense. So
it's a context study.
So moving from that, well, here it is. Here, this entire book is my attempt to peel back the understanding that the ancients had intuitively. And so you mentioned a few things. The Israelites built altars in a four-horn style, which we see in Exodus. And then similarly, there was a similar horn style altar for King Thutmose III in the 15th century.
Yes.
At Karnak. And by the 9th and 10th centuries, the horn incense altars were normal occurrence in the Levant. But you said that there's no antecedent or successor or contemporary of the ark, though. in the
No,
Levantine, right?
there isn't in Levantine culture, which is very interesting.
In the Egyptian culture, which is what we're getting to, and this is why it's the
Mm-hmm.
Egyptian context of the ark. And so before we really get to anything else, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the difference between the Levantine and Egyptian understanding of this sacred space, because
Right.
they were similar, but the whole thing about the ark is that you have this sacred space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this unclean space. And
Yes.
God has to dwell in this sacred space, which we'll get into about the Egyptians and how they understood that. But tell us just, briefly, what's some of the differences and kind of developments, I guess you could say, something like that.
Okay. Well, the whole idea of sacred versus profane space is very, very strong in Egyptian religious culture. Okay. And it's the idea that if you want a god to hang around its idol, you have to give it an environment that it finds comfortable. You make sure that it is ritually clean. And that ritual cleanness is very easy to contaminate. So the Egyptians had a strong demarcation, because the idea is if you introduce something that's ritually unclean, then your god's going to forsake their idol. They're going to take their blessing with you, and they can even become vindictive, because gods in Egypt weren't necessarily good. They were ambivalent.
Right. Capricious.
Yeah, they were capricious, like the goddess Sekhmet. She could both heal you, but she healed you because she withdrew the disease she gave you in the first place.
Yeah, so you said that there you got a chapter on that where you're talking about at one point where you're kind of like, hey, look, you kind of want to like coerce it into staying, because if it leaves, then all of the blessings that this deity just gave your culture of crops and all this stuff is going away. And in fact, they might even attack you because they're like a hornet. They're like provoked or whatever.
Yeah. Now, the Egyptians had this very, very strong concept. As I said, a strong demarcation. They went through a lot of purity rituals before they entered a temple. They washed the temple. They kept it clean. Even offerings had to go through a purification ritual before they were acceptable for use. Whereas, say, on the Levant, they didn't have that strong separation between sacred and profane. So in the Levant, you could put any old idol on a dusty shelf, and that was perfectly acceptable.
Right. Yeah, so that's interesting. I did read that about the Levant. Really, they didn't have this kind of distinction.
And I think the Israelites carry with them a lot of that understanding with them.
Right, the difference, like the sacred space and the profane space. Yeah, so you make that clear in the book, and that's why I'm suggesting everybody to get it, because it definitely makes a good case for that. But just before we leave the part about the Exodus for this ritual furniture and to talk about the ark, you mentioned at the very end that minimalist scholars kind of dismissed the Exodus as an invention of Babylonian writers in the 6th century, but there's too many details to give that credibility. Egyptian vocabulary, Dynasty 19, place names, and other problems related to the mud brick construction. And some portions of Exodus are exceptionally ancient and contain details that would only be known by someone living in the 13th century. So let's talk about the documentary hypothesis for a second.
Sure.
And so I listened to a lecture series on this years ago, and it really is that they find different texts, and they say, okay, so in Deuteronomy, we think this was written by this source, and then you've got this priestly source, and then you have this J source. So they have these, like, I think 5 sources maybe. And
it was originally 4.
Okay, so 4.
Now it's something like 16.
Okay, yeah. So they just, when they find things that they want to chalk up to it being unreliable, they just say, well, it's probably another source wrote it. Well, you're saying, well, hang on a second. Why then, if this was written by a Babylonian writer in the 6th century, why didn't they use more Babylonian type writing, like Old Iranian? Why instead are they using all this Egyptian writing, like language similarity? Why don't you start just tell us about the reason why you see problems with the documentary hypothesis, and then we'll move on after that.
Okay, well, the documentary hypothesis essentially states that the Exodus, if anything at all, was an oral tradition. That the more generous proponents of the documentary hypothesis will say, started coming into formation around the 9th century BC, and then was redacted and reformulated several times, and then was put to ultimate writing around the 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC. Okay? And it was basically written down in a Babylonian context. Okay, so when the Israelites were exiled to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II, once they're in Babylon, they start, formulating and writing down all their scriptures at that point. Okay, now I reject that as I said, for a couple of reasons. One, I reject it because there are some portions of the Pentateuch that are very, very old. And they have cultural references. They have geographic references. They've got references that nobody in Babylon would even have any idea what it means. There's also the whole vocabulary issue. A recent work by Benjamin Noonan did an excellent study of the whole vocabulary issue in the Pentateuch, where he does that analysis of, say, non-Semitic loanwords that are in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And he focuses on the Old Testament here. And he goes from, say, the Torah all the way to the later historical books and the minor prophets. And he does this analysis, and he shows very, very deftly that we've got this high proportion of Egyptian words in, say, the Pentateuch, but a very low proportion, say, later on in the minor prophets and the historical books, just like we would expect. So there's that aspect, but there's also other things too, like the example is names, personal names. We see a lot of Egyptian personal names in the Pentateuch. Names like Potiphar, Pa-di-Re, he is the gift of Re. Her is another one, Horus, and it just goes on. There's a lot of Egyptian names in the Pentateuch.
Sure, but it was interestingly enough,
if you're going to forge something, you should at least try to make it a good forgery,
Right? Yeah, it just doesn't make sense why they're using so much Egyptian terminology and names and things like this if it was written in Babylon.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that maybe they're trying to make it look Egyptian, but at the same time,
but how would you know it?
Much. Yeah, exactly. There's too much that is unknown to their period that they're using, right?
Well, how would they know about a minor town called Per Atum,
right?
Pithom.
It just So that would be
Pihahirot. Pihahirot is exceptionally minor town.
Exactly.
It's only mentioned once in Egyptian texts.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, but interestingly enough, though, you talk about all the Egyptian names, but the one Egyptian name that everybody or a lot of people think is Egyptian, Moses, you say nay to that.
I say it is Egyptian.
Oh, you do? I thought you were saying that it was.
It's not derived from the etymology that most people think it is.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so a lot of Egyptologists will say that it was derived from the Egyptian word mes, which means to be born. Now, the Hebrew scriptures tell us that he's called Moses because he's drawn from the water. Now, etymologically, Moses is not MSS or M Samach Samach. It's M Sheen Hey. It's Moshe.
Gotcha.
So it's not even a good etymological fit. But we do have another class of name in Egyptian. Instead of, say, the Messes names, we have what's called an Emshe name, as in Amen Emshe, Amen of the pool.
Okay. So
they just cleave off the theophoric element, the Amen, and you're left with Emshe, Moshe.
Okay. I see where I messed up.
Drawn from the water.
Okay. Pool.
Drawn, or in Egyptian, literally from the pool.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's where I knew that you had a different understanding of the etymology of the term, but I thought it was Levantine for some reason. Okay. So with that, let's move to the temple furniture, ritual furniture. The reason why this interests me so much is when I bought the book, the Ark of the Covenant, in its original Egyptian context, I didn't think about the Ark being a piece of furniture. But what's so interesting is I build furniture. Like I do that. That's my passion on the side. I build cabinets and all kind of like furniture for people. I get commissioned all the time. So I'm literally spending hours in the garage just building stuff. And so I had a definite affinity with the rest of the book here because it's all about furniture and how it developed. And I love to start off. I love how you talk about at the beginning of chapter 2, which is comedically called "Getting Comfy with Ritual Furniture." And so
I did try to make it an entertaining read.
Yeah. So
and I put in as much humor as the editors at Hendrickson would allow me.
Yeah. So with that being said, you give a good analogy at the beginning. You say, hey, listen, let's say you come into a summer cash and let's say you hit the lottery or something like that. What you would do is you would go out and get like a status symbol would be like a car, like a really fancy car, like maybe a Lamborghini or something. But in the ancient times of Egypt and in these ancient Egypt times, the status symbol really was like if you had a chair or a table, right? Or something like
furniture.
Or a bed.
Yep.
So
we find this even in the Bible, where when Samaria gets rich,
and Amos or something like that. Amos.
Yeah. Right. And the elite of Samaria, they start buying for themselves beds of ivory.
Right.
Okay.
So I actually have that marked here to mention. So you said that most Israelites, beds and chairs were out of their income brackets, but later during the reign of Jeroboam, Samaria became wealthy. And you quote the passage Amos 6:4, which says, "Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves upon their couches."
Yep.
And they're just kind of saying like, woe to you if you're buying Lamborghinis and you got a nice watch on and stuff like, I've wondered though. You didn't mention this in the book, but the passage in Deuteronomy, I believe it's the 4th chapter with Og, king of Bashan. That's an interesting verse there because
with his iron bed.
Yeah. Well, first, the first interesting thing is that it says he's the last of the Raphites, and so we don't want to get on that tangent because that's off the topic. But then it says, and his bed, which is I think they said like 9 cubits or something, his iron bed, isn't it still in Rabath or something like that? And so they're saying like that huge bed, isn't that big iron bed just still sitting there in Rabath or whatever?
The frame is still there, yeah.
Right. And so they're I wondered if that was kind of related when I read this.
Well, that showed you this kind of lifestyle that Og had, that he needed this huge bed.
Yeah, so that was interesting. I thought, that kind of, as soon as I started reading this, I was like, that popped into my head. So I'm glad that I'm making these connections with this. But like you said, if you don't have the context of this, you're not, when you're reading a story about the Israelites in the Bible, you're not necessarily thinking that they're not sitting on furniture, or that the majority of them are probably sitting in a tent on the floor or with animals.
People ate on the floor.
Yeah.
That's where they had dinner. Your typical Israelite would throw down a carpet and then serve food on that carpet. They might have a little platter to serve it on to protect the carpet, but that's what they ate, lying reclined. This was the typical way of eating back then. It's only later that they start building for themselves tables and chairs and eat at a table. But that was still back then. That was still something only the rich did.
Sure. And so that's okay. So we're getting more into the Egyptian context now. And you're saying that the Egyptians believed that drawings kind of had magical powers, right? They had this thing where they tied, in Egyptian metaphysics, they kind of tied writing with magic. So if you wrote a mild curse on a piece of paper, it actually, to them, it would change the mechanics of the world. That you wrote that.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, because it's not here in the book, but I wanted to ask you, is that somehow related to the Israelites? And maybe you haven't thought about this, or you don't know, but I wonder if that's related to the Israelites. Instead of writing, the word of God, right, becoming flesh, and you hear a lot of references to like life and death is in the tongue, and a lot of the spoken word has like this kind of meaning like that in the biblical text, it seems like.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do find curses in the Bible. We don't find a lot of magic spells, but we do find curses, and we do find the application of magic. So there would have probably most likely been some aspect of that worldview in there.
Gotcha. Okay. And so they had a priest that carried a statue of their god out to mingle with people, because so I want to talk about the difference between, with the Israelite, you point out that the Israelites kind of had a different view, where they all were kind of in this communion with God, where the Egyptians had like this distinction between the wealthy or higher class and the lower class, right?
Yes.
And so what the priest would kind of do is take these stone idols that supposedly had the god in it and parade it out to the people, in a procession.
Well, they were generally made of metal.
Oh, metal. Okay, gotcha.
Metal. You have to understand, for the Egyptians, gods were the flesh, and the bones of the gods were metal. Flesh of gold, bones of iron.
Gotcha.
So it was typically a gold or electrum idol that was then sort of decorated with precious stones.
But without the ritual furniture, there is no procession. There's
no procession, because there's no sacred space. Because what these pieces of ritual furniture were miniature temples. They were essentially capsules of sacred space that they could take their god and move it outside of a temple without it becoming ritually defiled.
Right. So that's the point of the ark and the tabernacle, is that they're having to move, but there will be no need for these once we have a temple that God can dwell in, right?
Yes.
And so that's kind of the thing. But with the Egyptians, they had the temple, but they used these processional things like the barks, which we'll get into later, in these boxes for movement to, I guess, accompany ordinary people, or was that the main use?
Well, when they were moved outside, I mean, the bark served a couple of purposes. It was the throne from which the god ruled. Okay. Sure. So it was more than just for bringing people out into the bringing a god out to the people. It was where, on a day-to-day basis, the god established his reign. That's where his throne was. His throne was inside the bark. Now, the bark was in the very, very center of the temple. That's the holiest space in the temple, in the very center.
Which is different from the Levantine, which is in the back of the temple, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, there is a back portion to the temple which has, say, a naos that the god sleeps in at night. but the center is the most holy place.
Right. And so, sorry, for people who don't know about the bark terminology, it's basically a boat, right? In their terminology, or in our terminology today.
It's a shrine shaped like a boat.
Yes. And you really got me with the point of, like, I was thinking to myself when I'm reading about all these barks and all these different time periods of, like, how you can tell the temple because of how the bark moved in and all that type of thing. And I was thinking to myself, like, why, like, a boat seems like a trivial thing. And then you're like, well, think about it. They were built around rivers and the Nile and all that. Like, boats were the way to travel.
Yep.
And so it was like a huge thing to them.
Yep.
And so the gods, when they want to move, they travel, and they have these barges, which is more than that. It's a shrine, like you said. But yeah.
Well, the wheel wasn't brought to Egypt until the Second Intermediate Period. We always assume that the wheel has been around forever, and it really hasn't. It's invented in Mesopotamia around 2500 BC. It's fairly recent with the history of man as far as it goes down. Again, it's one of those things. It's been around so long, we just assume it's been around forever. We see Fred Flintstone, making a wheel, and we think it goes back to the caveman era. Well, it doesn't. It's very recent.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks again to the context. And why don't we talk about a little bit about analogical thinking? Because you mention it in the book, and you say that, like, basically it's that the Egyptians would take mundane things and elevate their use to the status of, like, participation with the gods in some type of holy thing. Okay, let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, this is how they sort of extrapolated their religious thinking. So they would take, say, the objects that they had from daily life, and all cultures in the ancient Near East did this. Okay, so it wasn't just the Egyptians. You find this in Mesopotamia too. But they would take something that they were familiar with, and then they would sort of extrapolate on it into what was, say, divine drama. Okay, so they would say, okay, you've got all these false doors in the tomb. And the question is always, what is the meaning of these false doors? Well, it's going from this after they're equating going from this life to the afterlife, just like you would walk from one room to another through a door. Right. So the door becomes the symbol of that transition into the afterlife. The door is raised in thinking from just an ordinary object, a mundane object we use every day, to something that has greater, more pregnant religious significance.
Yeah, and so you mentioned you have a picture in the book of this giant door that you photographed, and so that kind of made me think, though, the way that Christ uses the language that I am the door, and the way that the symbology of the door was used there, and so. It may have been
the Bible uses this all over the place. Like when during the flood, the windows of heaven opened up and the rain poured.
Right.
Well, windows?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I kind of take a little bit of I take Walton's view on some of that you have anthropomorphic language in the Bible, and maybe I want you to speak on this a little bit, that by that, what we mean is that humans are trying to describe something not like the terrestrial realm in terrestrial terms. Yeah. So why don't you talk to us just a little bit about anthropomorphic language? You talk about anamorphic language on your channel with the cat gods and jackal gods and things like that.
Yes.
Talk about in the Bible a little bit about this anthropomorphic kind of view of some of these things. Yeah.
Okay. The anthropomorphic principle is we take something that is sort of greater, and we give it an animal-like quality. Okay. So, we might sometimes hear the wind outside at night, and we hear the dogs howling. Okay.
Right.
We're ascribing an animal characteristic to a force of nature. Well, the Egyptians would do this as far as divine things as well. This is one of the reasons why many of these deities were anthropomorphic. They expressed qualities of nature inside their divinities.
Right. And so sometimes we do this with our human aspects. Like I'll think about this sometimes when I'm thinking about the description of heaven and hell, right?
Yeah.
When you see like pearl gates in a gold brick road and things like this, and and you're wondering like when you're juggling with the idea of like Paul and the new body and the heaven, being in heaven, and you're like spiritual place, and you're like, but it's got gates of pearl and gold, and it's like,
well, the Psalm says, Yahweh says, under my feathers will you trust, and under my wings will you trust, and under my feathers.
Right.
Yeah. He's not actually saying he's a bird. He's not saying he's a chicken.
Yeah.
If
so
you read that in a wooden literal fashion, of course, you're going to get into trouble.
You get a lot of this too with like the Lord stretched out his hand, or it says like, and the Lord sat, and it says, and the Lord spoke with Moses, and stuff like this. You get a lot of this talk. So I just wanted to briefly mention that because, I'm working on this beginner series, and I just wanted to kind of, hear your take on that. So
Christ is described as having a sword coming out of his mouth.
Right. That's another
it's not a literal sharpened piece of steel coming out of his mouth.
Yeah. So with that, that's another great scripture to point that out. Let's try to get through the to sacred space. So
okay,
gods did not tolerate the presence of impurity, so they had to have these sacred spaces. And in Egyptian terms, these sacred spaces could be highly pliable, right?
Yes.
Which was different from the later Hebrew formulation of the same concept. So with that, can you talk a little bit about, you say that in the book that you could have just like an empty room, right? And it's just like a regular space. Yeah. But in Egyptian culture, if you just added like a table, now all of a sudden you can turn that space into a different type of space.
Well, we do it too.
Right, we do that as well. That's a good point.
As well. If you've got an empty space and you put a couch in and a TV, well, now you got a living room.
Right, exactly.
You put a kitchen table and chairs, now you got a kitchen. You put a bed in it, now you got a bedroom.
Right, and that's how they thought about their sacred spaces.
Yeah,
was in these terms.
So they put a sacred bark in a space. Now it is a set weret, a great throne.
Yeah, and the bark seemed to me it's just like in nautical terms. It's kind of like how people that live near the coast will have, and they're fishermen, they have like a lot of anchors and stuff, and you see a lot of these types of things on the barks and on the different types of ropes and stuff on the iconography and stuff.
Yes, you do. Yes.
So
there's great attention to detail on these sacred barks. And unfortunately, I could just only scratch the surface of that in this book. Because it gets so detailed with the minutia of the meaning of each particular symbol. You sort of weigh that against, well, am I going to lose my audience here who's really more interested on the Ark of the Covenant than they are on every minute detail of a sacred bark and what it means?
Yeah, because I'm going through, I'm like, there's this type of box and this type of box and this type of box and this type of box. And there's like, you get to learn about all these type of boxes, and then you learn about this type of bark, which is the boat. And you go through the different types, and you're getting, although you're getting this education on these things about, these different types of furniture, you're starting to understand the evolution of the sacred furniture. Oh, wow. And one thing I found like interesting was in one of the hieroglyphs, and you mentioned this, is that it shows Egyptians using those shoulder straps to move furniture that we use today. And I was just like, no way, they had that then. Isn't
Yes.
that incredible?
When I saw that the first time, I go, wow, that's actually really neat.
Yeah.
There was a few innovations that the Egyptians did that were really very interesting. And that's one of them. And another one was the poles with the flanges on it to prevent them from rotating. Now, they didn't use it. I mean, it was like a one-off. But when I actually went to Egypt and I actually took that photograph, because, I first, encountered that photograph in a published book. So, you have to kind of go back to Egypt and check the source, check the original. So, when I saw the original, I almost walked right past it because it's like at hip level. But when I saw it, I recognized it instantly because of those flanges. It's like, oh, that's the picture.
Yeah, and you have a picture in the book of a box that shows the door sliding locks.
Yes,
that you can still pick up at Home Depot. You put on your house or your building. Or
yes,
your
you
garage.
do. Yeah,
and yeah, because I build furniture all the time, and I use those. Those little like sliding locks, and just looking at those, like, man, this is incredible. Just to see some of that. But so we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to read the passage here. You say that in Egypt, God had to be coerced to stay. That is, you had to hold the captive, the idol, against their will to be of service. But if the gods fled, they would take with them any blessings and protection. The Ark of the Covenant was thus a radical departure from the idolatry model of divine blessing. Instead of God forced to stay and bless, the God of Israel remained voluntarily and blessed by establishing a treaty or a covenant. Should we talk a little bit about the term covenant and how it relates to the term conspiracy in Egypt and how that evolution maybe happened? Why don't you tell us about it?
Well, what we have is this idea of what in the Hebrew they call a dut, conspiracy. And the original name of the Ark of the Covenant was the Ark of the Conspiracy, which sounds, it's translated, though, in most Bibles as Ark of the Testimony, because that is a possible rendering. But it has the idea of being somewhere between a criminal conspiracy to, say, a last will and testament. So the meaning is somewhere in between there. But what it's trying to point out is the idea of negotiation. So basically you have a buyer and a seller come together, and what they do is they start negotiating. They form this little conspiracy of where they come to terms for the transaction. So the Ark of the Testimony is the idea that God is negotiating with his people. And then once the covenant is established, the Ark undergoes this name change, where it's no longer the Ark of the Testimony or conspiracy. It's now the Ark of the Covenant, the covenant being a contract.
And that changes in, I think, Joshua. I don't have
Joshua is the last occurrence of the Ark of the Testimony.
Right, and then it changes.
But it changes around Numbers chapter 9 through 11. Somewhere in there it changes.
There's a definite change, though, from it being called the Ark of the Testimony to it being called from then on the Ark of the Covenant.
And that occurs in the book of Numbers.
Okay. And do you want to maybe just touch on that as maybe some of the reasoning behind that?
So essentially what happens is all the people have to agree to the covenant. So they're at Mount Sinai. Moses goes up, he gets the tablets, he destroys them the first time. And then he comes back with the second set is, do you actually agree to all this?
Right.
And the people say, yes, we do. And then the Shekinah glory descends upon the tabernacle.
Right. And so that's from there on, they're in agreement.
They're in agreement.
They're in a covenant.
They're in a covenant.
A contract, even.
It is a contract.
They sign the contract there. There are the terms. If you don't follow it, you're going to get curses. If you do follow it, you get blessings. And you got to be circumcised as part of the that would makes the Abrahamic. But we've been looking at a lot of the trees, but the forest view, at least part of it, is that the Israelites, although they came in through Abraham and through Joseph, and they have this more Mesopotamian, Levantine type, or Amoritic, we might say, origin.
Yes.
But because they lived in Egypt for so long, they even were worshiping and doing some of the same rituals as the Egyptians for all this time.
Yeah.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And so when they left,
the archaeological context tells us that they were idolaters.
Right,
they worship Baal, Resheph, and Astarte.
Yeah, and then the first chance they get to run back to the golden calf, right? They did.
That's default worship.
Yeah, exactly. So that
the cult par excellence in Egypt was Hathor worship. More than any other god or goddess in Egypt, Hathor was the goddess everybody worshipped in Egypt. It was the goddess par excellence. It was the cult par excellence. So it's only natural for them to default back to that once they think that, Yahweh's not going to pan out.
Yeah, so they get kind of confused or impatient with Moses when he's up in the mountain. And they're like, make us this golden calf, because Moses dragged us out here. And so they instantly go back to what they know. And so with that, they also had these ritual practices that they picked up from Egypt. Now, a lot of times they used similar practices, but as a polemic. So I wanted to ask you as well, because, maybe I'll take this and use it for part of this series that I'm working on, but I hear a lot with like John Walton and other guys like that, the importance and Heiser, the importance of polemics. We hear about sometimes like the rider on the clouds motif is like a throwback to Baal, but it's like saying like, no, our God is the rider on the clouds kind of thing. And so, tell us a little bit about how important polemics were to the Hebrews coming out of these cultures.
Okay. Well, it is very important, and we do see this in several motifs in regards to, say, the Exodus. For example, we see God as, using, say, the conquest language of, I will bring my people out with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand. Now, that is reflective. That's language that we actually see the Egyptian kings use. What they're doing is it's an allusion to a martial scene where you have Pharaoh with one arm stretched out, holding the hair of many Semitic captives or Nubian captives or whatever captives he's got.
Oh, right.
And in the other hand, he's got a mace and he's about to bash skulls.
I know exactly the one you're talking about because I've commented on that one before because of the relative size of the Pharaoh, I think it was, right? Or is it?
There is some of that, yeah.
So he's holding these regular sized guys up like by their hair, but he's like much taller than they are.
Oh yeah, he's always portrayed as a giant.
Right. So typically archaeologists or like scholars will just say like he was kind of embellishing his size, but do you think there's any case that
it's to show his importance.
Gotcha. Okay.
You don't want a short Pharaoh.
Yeah, sure. Right. You want a powerful, rich guy.
You want a powerful Pharaoh who can protect the supply of food. We have to remember that Egypt lived according to knife-edge agriculture. The average diet back then was 50 calories away from starvation.
Right.
Everyone lived on a knife-edge agricultural diet.
So they wanted somebody.
Yeah. So if you all of a sudden had drought and famine, it killed people within a couple weeks because they didn't have the fat supplies to survive a prolonged famine.
So this could because of the importance of that, this could kind of explain why Joseph was put on such a high position instead of just like, oh, you told a dream, like good, I'll make you I'll make you down the line somewhere. Instead, it was like he's second, right? Because he really did with that. Okay.
He was not only gifted from God, he was also clever.
Right, but also reading dreams was huge back then, right?
It was huge, but it also wasn't something that was free-wheeled either.
Okay.
I mean, the average Egyptian believed that dreams could be prophetic. Now, not every dream, but a lot of dreams could be prophetic. But dreams were a codified thing. You went to a reference text, you went to a priest who read from a reference text to interpret your dream. So we have a copy of one of these reference texts, Papyrus Chester Beatty 3, the Dream Book, which is just a list of interpretations, dreams and their interpretation, and whether they're good or bad. So when we if you get somebody who has a dream that's not in the reference text, they don't know what to do because it's not in the book.
Yeah, because
the oracle didn't come up with the interpretation.
Right, because they had these books of like interpretations of dreams,
yes.
Right? And so you mentioned this and you're like, not in the book, but in your other work. And you're just saying like, hey, listen, they had these books that told you about interpreting dreams. And the difference though, is that Joseph didn't have these interpretation books. And in fact, while in the Egyptian culture, the treading of the winepress was a negative thing.
Yep.
In the jail or in the prison, Joseph foretold the dream of the winepress prisoner as being a positive thing.
Yeah, that's why that prisoner was so. That's why the cupbearer was so worried. He was sweating bricks because he's got this dream that looks like it's going to end up really, really bad for him.
Right. And so I can see how that would kind of be an unintentional way to kind of add credibility to the biblical text story there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And so speaking of polemics as well, you say in the book that the origins narrative that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, this origin story prompted the Israelites to abandon the Egyptian 10-day week and institute the 7-day week instead. And that this origin narrative of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters is a polemic against other creation myths. The narrative makes no attempt to relate the mystery of the creation in analogical terms. And the biblical origin story is kind of, in that way, an anti-myth.
Yes.
So that's another good example of polemics against that.
Yes,
that culture.
It is. And we have to remember that when the Israelites come out of Egypt, they become Israelites as a result of the Exodus. They're not Israelites at Avaris. They're a cosmopolitan people at Avaris. You got sons of Jacob there. You got Libyans. You got Nubians. You got Magi. You got some Egyptians. You got all sorts of different ethnic groups out of Varus. It's only when they leave through the Exodus that they become one people, the Israelites. This is the so-called mixed multitude. So you've got all these people coming out with different ideas about, say, creation. So this is a new anti-myth that teaches anti being instead of myth. Okay? So instead of all these half dozen myths that they're coming out of Egypt with, there's this instead of myth to replace those.
Gotcha. Okay. And yeah, so and just to touch on what you were talking about earlier, as far as the difference in class and worship, I was reading or listening to a lecture series, maybe it was, on the difference between class in the laws, right? And a lot of the laws of that time period, like the Code of Hammurabi and some of these other law codes, you had a separate kind of punishment for the wealthy and the lower class. Okay. And So there were like a
Law
difference.
didn't work
here.
that way in Egypt.
It didn't. Okay, so
Nope.
that's what I was going to ask: is was it the same way that Egyptians had a different law for?
Nope.
Okay, so the law worked across the board.
The law was very different in Egypt.
But didn't
The
you
Egyptians had no law.
Okay, I see.
Okay. There was only there was no laws in Egypt. Okay, not until the time of King Horemheb. King Horemheb is the first king to actually establish a law in Egypt.
Yeah.
And it was an anti-corruption law.
Okay.
Okay. So what they did instead in Egypt was there was only 2 offenses. Okay. There was an offense against the king, and that was punishable by death. Didn't matter what it was. You steal a bronze toothpick from the king, you died.
Right.
Okay. And then you had everything else. And everything else was, at that point, how much did it disrupt society?
Okay. See, this is what I was remembering.
And oftentimes, you got scot-free. Or you got beat. Rarely it would be capital punishment, but that was rare.
Yeah. So it didn't really matter necessarily if you got punished for it.
No, like for example, you could steal someone's donkey as long as it wasn't the king's donkey, and then your neighbor would have to go to court against you. He'd go to the temple. He'd say, my neighbor stole my donkey, and the temple would say, okay, yeah, you're right. This is your donkey. Go. Here's the judgment. The neighbor would go back to the guy who stole the donkey. He goes, I want my donkey back. And the guy goes, tough luck.
Yeah.
So he got to go back to court to get another judgment, to enforce the first judgment, and so on.
Yeah, see, that's so I remember you kind of saying that now, and I remember you talking about as well, because you said disrupting society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm remembering you saying about Joseph and the Pharaoh's wife desiring Joseph.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't have been in trouble, like a person like her wouldn't have been in trouble necessarily for the infidelity.
She would have been in trouble because of the violation of class.
The class, right. That's the point.
She would have been in trouble for that.
Because he was such on a lower tier.
Such a lower tier.
Okay. It wasn't necessarily
she was the wife of one of the top men in the military. That puts Potiphar at a very high class. And she being the wife of that, she's in the same class. Now she's she's trying to have sexual relations with someone like 3 tiers below that, 3 or 4 tiers below that. So that's not going to fly.
Yeah, so that's really, it wasn't about the infidelity.
It's not about the infidelity.
Yeah, so that's another distinction. So I'm seeing the distinction between the other Levantine groups with this, difference in class in their law,
mm-hmm.
and then with the Egyptians, when really it wasn't like a strict code necessarily. It was just more like, if you were definitely caught red-handed, you might be punished. If not, they weren't going to really worry about it, kind of thing.
Normally, what would happen to a woman of that status if she, say, fooled around with another general? Is it in a divorce?
Okay, and it was pretty regular.
Divorce was very common.
Okay.
Okay, marriages in ancient Egypt were revolving doors. One could very easily enter into divorce or into marriage and very easily leave it. And it almost never went to the courts unless there was some issue about, say, the divorce settlement.
Okay. So, all right. So I want to ask you then, just kind of transitioning a little bit about this Stela HSM that's found at Sarah Bit El
Khadim. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So,
the famous Sinai 375A. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. No, but actually, first I was going to say, man, that's a nice SG you got back there. I'm guessing it's an SG.
It's an Epiphone SG, yeah, Pro.
I actually have a Epiphone Studio right here. So
they're nice guitars.
Yeah.
I like the Epiphones.
Oh, I do too. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going out of my way to get the Gibson, but
oh no, I can't afford a Gibson.
No,
This is way beyond my price range.
Yeah, and I'm really playing a lot right now because I've got my son will be due to be here in the end of June, so I'm cranking up the amp as much as possible right now. And
okay,
what type of music do you like, by the way?
I have very eclectic taste in music.
Okay, you play.
I like a lot of electronica. I like a lot of what's called new age music. I like symphonic metal. I have very eclectic taste in music. I even like movie soundtracks.
Okay, cool.
Part of it was because one of my first jobs was I worked in a music section in a department store.
Oh, okay.
So I got to develop some refined taste in music at that point.
Yeah, I grew up a punk rock kid, so I played in a punk band in high school, and so I've always liked fast music and stuff like that. But I also, I like a lot of stuff. I just don't like new age country music. That's one of the only things.
I'm not into rap myself.
Yeah.
I can do without the rap.
Yeah, some of the older hip hop I'm okay with because it's really more about like knowledge and stuff like that, and like they would have, like their ciphers, and if you came in and you weren't like telling some type of knowledge, or something, then they would like push you out of the middle of the circle, But now it's just about junk and it's meaningless. So
yeah,
so very few, but there's some early stuff that would, actually have some meaning. But anyway, sidetrack. I digress. Let's talk about this still. So you say that any reading of this would be kind of controversial.
It is controversial, yes. Part of it is that the text, the inscription is very shallow. It's a very shallow inscription.
Would you say the importance of this still is that and you said that you use specialized photographic techniques to kind of get the inscriptions where it's not degraded. You really had a clear, readable spot using like strobe light technology. Yeah. Would you say the real significance of this is that it shows a barge type object being used outside of Egypt in more of a Levantine environment?
There's two significance to it. Okay. It's a very rare example of a bark relief from the Middle Kingdom. Those are very rare. We don't have much of anything from the Middle Kingdom just because most of those temples were destroyed and used as their parts were recycled in other temples. So we've got very little evidence of barks from the Middle Kingdom. Now we know we actually got more from the Old Kingdom for barks than we do from the Middle Kingdom. So we don't even have much of an idea of what they looked like from the Middle Kingdom. So it's very significant in that respect. The other thing that makes it so significant is that we find it outside of the Nile Valley. We find it at Serebet al-Qadam in Sinai. We know that there was a temple of Hathor there because we find lots of dedication stela there. So we find a lot of evidence of that temple. So it must have had a shrine or a bark in it because that's the normal pattern of Egyptian temples.
Okay.
You didn't just put your god on a plinth in a temple. You had to put it in a shrine, an upright shrine, like a Kar shrine, K-A-R, or a sacred bark. So this sort of tells us which one it is.
Okay, so that's kind of, and it's also the location.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so
that's very significant. Very significant.
Yeah, that's showing us the evolution pattern. Yeah. And now, just kind of here, we're getting close to the end of this. There's couple things I want to talk about. One is briefly. This is the one that I think is really going to turn people off and make people be like, I don't like that. Is that we have Egyptian coffins and Egyptian furniture that has these winged goddesses with their wings spread, protecting the inner parts of this. And so with the ark, we have the cherubim with their arms, with their wings spread facing each other, protecting. Okay. So maybe tell us a little bit about the perceived evolution there. And then secondly, let's hear, think about the objection that, what are you saying, that we're using goddesses to protect Yahweh's throne? And tell us, what do you...
I'm kind of losing you. You're going to have to repeat that last bit. I kind of lost you there. Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, sorry about that. So, and tell us, the objection about the winged goddesses, being an evolution, oh no, that's going too far. What do you think?
Well, the winged goddesses are, you see, when you talk about gods and goddesses in Egypt, they didn't have a word for angel. Okay, they didn't have it. To them, it was all gods. It was all goddesses. But some were definitely minor and some were major. So for them, when we talk about, say, the winged goddesses or the Uraeus, these were minor deities. These would be more akin to angels. Okay? So that is when that symbolism is adopted. It's using that sort of the idea that the angels are surrounding the deity, creating sacred space for the deity. And it is a biblical motif.
Veil, kind of.
Yeah, it is a biblical motif, where you have the cherubim and the seraphim surrounding the seat of the Lord, proclaiming, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." So this is something that we do find, and we find this all on the tabernacle, where the entire holy space, the curtains, are embroidered with these winged, cherubim. And we find the cherubim on the mercy seat of the ark. And even in the Temple of Solomon, there's apparently 2 statues of cherubim that have their arms stretched out over the Holy of Holies. So it's everywhere, and it's the same sort of idea here.
Right. Okay.
Now, where it originates, the earliest we find it in Egypt is with the reign of Amenhotep III. That's the earliest we find it in Egypt so far. It could be earlier, but that's the earliest we find it so far.
Gotcha. Okay. So this sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, that was the one that I really seen and was like, whoa, okay. It's a picture, and it just has the 4 corners with the wings spread. Yep. And so, that definitely shows a big similarity. And knowing the context of coming out of Egypt, you definitely understand that that's going to be, where that usage came from. Now, you say that, is it possible that, okay, so here's another thing, is there's a myth, you say there's a myth around, and I agree with you, and everybody will know this, that if you touch the ark, you die, right? And the problem with that, there's many problems with that. Do you want to kind of explain, first of all, why it's likely that the men of Beth Shemesh saw the ark, and because they recognized it, it says? Do you want to explain?
Recognized it from a distance.
They recognized it from a distance, and so that obviously meant that it wasn't covered like it should have been. It
wasn't covered, yes.
And that's maybe why they lost that battle, right?
Well, first of all, when the men go to the tabernacle to get the ark, okay, they don't have permission. They're just coming and taking it. This mob shows up at the tabernacle in Shiloh and demands the ark because they're going to war. So they don't prepare the ark. There's no sort of dropping the tabernacle down and covering the ark and then putting the porpoise skins on it and preparing it for a parade. They just take it and go. So they've got this naked ark that they're taking out on the battlefield, and they lose. And they lose badly. So then the ark then, at that point, falls into enemy hands. It ends up at the Temple of Dagon, and they're handling the ark there. I mean, you get some Philistines with the ark; they're putting their grubby paws all over it. These are pagans. They know nothing about the scriptures. They'll pop off the top. They'll look inside. They don't see anything. Okay, that's they'll just manhandle it any old way. Some of them get tumors. Some of them die. But it's not. It doesn't have the same impact that it had on the men of Beit Shemesh. So the Philistines say, okay, this thing's bad. We got to get rid of it and appease the god that it came from. So they do the golden mice and the golden tumors, and they put it in a box beside the ark on an ark's cart, or say a milk cow cart, where the milk cows never pulled a load. That's really interesting too, because those milk cows are now ritually clean. They're
right,
ritually clean
because they never pulled a load, right?
They never pulled a load. They never carried a body.
But that's not what the Jeroboam and those guys did.
Well, what happens is, we'll get to Uzzah and Ahio in the moment. But what happens is they put this thing on the milk cart and they send it off. They just let it run away. Comes to Beit Shemesh, and the guys at Beit Shemesh, they see it from a distance. They know what this is. Okay, they're well-taught Israelites. They know what the Ark of the Covenant is when they see it. But what do? They pop the top off and look inside. They knew that was wrong. And that's why they were smote. It's because they knew it was wrong and they did it anyway. Okay? Now, in the case of, say, Uzzah and Ahio, who, when it returns to the threshing floor and David wants to bring it back into Jerusalem, okay, he has them put it on an ox cart. Now, we don't know the origin of the ox cart. Now, we are told that you're not supposed to, the only people who are supposed to, the sanctioned way to transport the ark is that it is carried by descendants of the clan of Kohath, the Kohathites. They're the only people who are allowed to touch the poles of the ark and live. Okay? So you have offense number one there. So they put it on an ox cart. That's bad. But what happens is the oxen rear up, throw the ark, and Uzzah touches it. And he is struck dead. Now, the reason he is struck dead is we find out that that he is the son of Abinadab. Abinadab is the brother of David. He's a Judahite. He's not a Levite. He's not a Kohathite. He's a Judahite. David was using his own nepotism here to bring the ark in. It was going to be a triumphal moment for him, where he brings the ark. His own kin are leading the parade, and it was supposed to be a triumphal moment. And what it does is it leads to a dead young man on the floor, because the forms of righteousness have not been obeyed.
Right. So it wasn't just because he touched the ark.
It wasn't just because he touched it. It was because of his pedigree and because it was handled in an improper manner.
Right.
Now, we do see this in other places too in the Bible where, double offense ends up in summary judgment. We do this today. let's say you're in your car and you're going a little over speed limit, and a cop's following behind you, and he doesn't pull you over, and you wonder why, and then you change lanes, and then the sirens go on, and he pulls you over. You get a ticket for speeding and an illegal lane change.
Right.
2 offenses. He can make one of those stick in court.
Yeah, it gives him more ammo, kind of.
Gives him more ammo.
Yeah, so
same thing here.
And then the other thing is that you have to think about is like if every time you touch the ark you die, then how did the Philistines move it, right?
Yeah.
How did they move it back?
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. But then it's like, oh, when it was brought back, they brought it back on a ritually, would you say pure or ritually clean, right? Because milk cows never had drug anything. Yeah. So they used it, right? Never pulled a load. So it was a ritually clean way that they brought it back. Basically, they were being polite.
They were being as respectful as they could understand to be.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Is that there were multiple offenses there, and so just kind of wrapping all this up. One thing you really said that I liked is you said the God of Israel, unlike some of the others, was merciful enough to condescend to the frailty and the ignorance of humankind. You see, because I use this a lot when I'm talking about, for example, people will say like in the Old Testament, they'll say, "Oh, look at this law here, this egregious and whatever," which it wasn't that egregious to them, right? No. But it's like, but you believe in laws that are objective, right? But it's like, well, even Christ said that, like, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart. He was saying like that. Mm-hmm. It was permitted because you're so barbaric that even that was an improvement on your time, basically, something like that. He says, but it wasn't so from the beginning. So he's saying like, there's this law at the beginning that you guys were so depraved that even this, doing this, the intent of doing better was better than, just what you would have been doing, basically. Yeah. And so I feel like that's kind of like what you were saying in that passage as well.
Well, God is respecting sort of the preconceived notions that the Israelites had about divinity, about the nature of God, and he slowly changes them over time with the law, the ark, the tabernacle. All these things slowly take those concepts, those late Bronze Age concepts of divinity, and flip them on their head.
Yeah, so
he inverts them. It's very clever. I mean, God is clever. I mean, right. But that's what he's doing here is he's taking for example, he respects the late Bronze Age idea of localism because the presence of God is following that ark wherever it goes. He's not restricted to that.
Sure. He's condescending.
He's condescending. He's condescending to their ideas and then uses their own ideas to change the way they think.
Yeah. You mentioned something else in the book. I was trying to remember what it was, what the term. I got just a couple more questions. Then if you got time, we'll do a couple of audience questions. But what was the term you used? Limited something, where you're talking about the difference between sacred and profane space. And
liminal inertia.
Liminal inertia.
Liminal inertia.
This sounds like, when I was reading about it, it sounds like the distinctions I make from the natural and supernatural. Mm-hmm. Because people, I've got this question since I was young. People will come up, say, well, show me the supernatural right now. And I've said this so many times on my channel, but like my response is typically like, you want me to show you the supernatural, but in natural terms. And you can see how that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't make any sense.
So when I was reading this distinction you're making with that, with the term, it seemed like the same kind of thing between the sacred and profane spaces.
Well, anthropologists talk about liminality all the time, which is that transition between the profane and the sacred. that liminality is that sort of that transition state between the sacred and the profane. But what I recognized in, say, Egyptian ritual was that they were overcoming a religious problem, which is the inertia bit. Profane things remain profane, and sacred things remain sacred unless something else acts upon them.
Okay.
That's inertia.
Yeah, you referenced Newton's law, right?
Newton's law. So what we have here is this idea that the Egyptians needed to do these rituals was to overcome this problem of liminal inertia.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and I just thought that was a good distinction to make, because I that was helpful to me, and I thought it kind of went along with something I that I was thinking as well. One of the last couple of questions I have for you is kind of different, so you can answer these as quick or as slow as possible, but
okay,
as you want.
Yes, no.
Yeah, or just give whatever you want in general on them. So one is about, we already talked about the importance of polemics. What do you think about John Walton's view of the temple dedication view of Genesis? Have you thought about that at all much?
I think it has some merit.
Okay.
I think it's got merit. I think there's definitely temple imagery in Genesis. There's definitely, even though the Imago Dei is sort of an establishment of it's couched in terms of, say, sacred images and even idolatry.
Okay.
So there's definitely something to it. I haven't read his views per se, but
you're familiar with the concept.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the concept, and I think there's some merit to it.
All right, so the last few are on basically like cults and religions. Okay. One is that there's a group that try to racialize a lot of different people in the Bible. So, for example, they'll say that all white people today are Edomites, right, from Esau, and God hated Esau, by the way, you know that. And then they'll say that the modern Chinese and Japanese are from the incestuous relationship of Ammon and that produced Ammon and Moab. So
yeah, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah.
On either one of those, I don't think so.
Okay. Do you want to expand at all?
Okay, sure. Ammon was wiped out probably by the Israelites. Okay. Moab was destroyed by the Assyrians, and the Edomites became the Edomians and persisted into Roman times when they were essentially absorbed by them.
Okay.
So, no, they don't have any ancient ancestry into the Chinese, the Japanese, or the white people.
And we know from, who was it, Josephus, I think, that said that at the war, in one of the wars, that the Idumeans were forced to convert to Judaism or be killed. So, yeah, that's also another
not that I trust Josephus on anything.
Right, sure. I mean, but
he's one of my 3 hated historians.
Really? You didn't like Josephus, huh?
I don't like Josephus. I don't like Herodotus, and I don't like Plutarch.
Well, Herodotus, didn't he say that there were giant ants, like the size of dogs, that were ants or something?
Some of the stuff he said was just crazy. I mean, he's coming out of a Alexandrian priestly mode, and so he's got a lot of sort of Platonic thinking that he sort of grafts onto Egyptian religion and Egyptian mythology, and he presents it like this is how people in the Ramesside period, thought about Egyptian religion, and no, nothing like that.
Okay,
nothing like that at all.
So you guys,
half of my problems are caused by those 3 guys.
Oh, really?
The other half is the patterns of evidence.
Right. Okay. So you guys, we're gonna wrap up here, but go ahead and give me your questions in the side chat. I'm going to ask my last question, and then I will go to your questions. So any questions you might have, just let me know in the side chat. So my last question is, I wonder what you thought about Mormonism and the golden Egyptian tablets or plates.
Okay.
Yeah.
The tablets supposedly excavated at in New York,
Right.
and written in Reformed Egyptian. And later on, the Book of Abraham, supposedly that Joseph Smith purchased from a papyrus salesman. Well, there's no such thing as Reformed Egyptian. It's not a language. We do have various types of Egyptian, but it's all a variant of standardized Egyptian. None of what Joseph Smith said was Reformed Egyptian is Egyptian. It's baloney. The other thing is that the text they did Mormon Church at one point published a really bad facsimile of the Book of Abraham, and it's clearly a vignette from the Book of the Dead. Essentially, the Osiris mummification scene where he's laid out on the embalming table.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that's interesting. I thought you might have a good, an interesting take on that. So since you're
basically what Joseph Smith does is he looks at the pictures of the hieroglyphs and tries to allegorize each one.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's what he's doing. Okay.
Yep. Now, we have to understand that already in Joseph Smith's lifetime, Egyptian had been translated. It had already been a known language by his time.
Okay.
Champollion had already effectively translated it.
Right, with the Rosetta Stone, right?
With the Rosetta Stone, yes.
Okay, I got you. So that kind of was the key to everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so he kind of had that understanding already, and he kind of was adding to it. It's kind of the same way he did with the Bible, I guess you could say, depending on your view, of course. But
it's kind of like the way that some say Gnostics will treat the Bible, where they will take a word and try to come up with an allegorical meaning for every word.
Well, I found it interesting that because you read a book on the Egyptian and the Gnostics, and kind of how, but so I seen a parallel one time. I was thinking about this, is that with there was an Egyptian that I think it's an Egyptian in their Egyptian religion. I'm not sure if it was the whole thing, or if it was like a short little piece, but it was like women had to become men in order to enter into heaven or something like that. The Egyptians had,
that's a Gnostic text.
Yeah, but there's another one though that's in Egyptian that they had to become a male deity or something to enter.
Well, okay, you do find vicarious associations.
Okay.
Now that's not the same as becoming a male deity. Like, for example, you'll find, say, in like the pyramid texts in the Book of the Dead, where every spell says, woman's name Osiris. That's a vicarious association. That's not a sexual transformation.
Okay.
Okay. The Egyptians did not look down on the female gender.
Okay.
Not in any way. In fact, probably the Egyptians had probably the most modern type treatment of women in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
An Egyptian woman was free to marry and divorce whoever that she wanted. Mm-hmm. She could adopt on her own initiative. She could work, earn money, hold jobs.
Metropolitan.
She was entitled to inheritance to some extent. Yeah, it was much more enlightened than what we see coming in later.
Now, I wondered if there was a connection, so maybe I was just imposing that. But we have a question here from S.J. Thomason. Says, has he read Dr. Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm, and does he? I know you have it on your bookshelf, so I know you have at least read part of it. And he says, does he believe the Egyptian gods could be some of the sons of God from Psalm 82? So
No.
Okay.
All
Because
right,
you know,
I think that the Egyptian gods are their own thing. I don't think they are the sons of God of Psalm 82.
okay.
Okay.
So but you're
I
familiar with
think
the divine council view
I
of,
am familiar with the divine council view. I think Heiser is partially correct. I think there are points where I think he's very correct. I think there's points where he presses it a bit too far.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, I think in the book of Job he's correct. He's absolutely correct that the sons of God in Job are a divine council. I have no question about that. When it comes to the reference in Genesis, I think he's incorrect. I think there's a better explanation for that. That's much more human.
Oh, really? Okay. So you take in Genesis 6, you would take a different view, you say?
I take a different view of Genesis 6. I think that what you have in Genesis 6 is priests who have violated a sexual vow, like the Naditum of Mesopotamia.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like for example, one example would be like Sargon of Akkad. You know, his mother is a Naditum who violates her sexual vow, gets pregnant, and has to rid herself of the child. And the child becomes a great king that usurps a throne.
Okay. Yeah, I think that he basically I think that basically people take two different approaches, right? One is looking at the context of the Near East of like I guess more Levantine, like with the Sumerians and the Akalu traditions and things like that, and then the others looking at the other side. So yeah, I can understand that. So
we find also in Mesopotamian writings as well references to the sons of Ishtar, and that's a class of priests. In Egyptian myth, we see Pharaoh references son of Re. He's the high priest of all Egypt.
Gotcha. And so yeah, I guess yeah.
So I think he's right in certain cases, and pushes it too far in others.
Yeah. So you would definitely agree. There's the context with the Book of Enoch and with Jude and Peter talking about the angels that sinned and things like this. There's that context, but you would just say that it may not be like 100% like what it may be part of the truth, but maybe not the whole.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to our next question. First I got to ask you, is one of your favorite Egyptian scholars the world-renowned Jordan Maxwell?
Who?
Because, oh man, you don't know Jordan Maxwell? He's the one who told us that Son S-U-N of God sounds like Son S-O-N of God in English.
That.
Yeah. Well, it sounds the same in English, so obviously.
Yeah, it doesn't sound the same like that. It doesn't sound like that in any other language.
That was so funny that he comes out with all these videos and he's like, Israel. It's Isis, Ra, and El, and it's like when he realizes that no, they're not pronounced that way in the original languages, you know.
No.
And he's like, oh, and son doesn't sound.
Isis isn't even Isis in Egyptian.
Right.
It's Iset.
And so anyway,
Iset.
world-renowned scholar though, just by the way.
You mean like David Rohl?
Right. Well, I'm not familiar with him, but I did see some videos that he put out of a new view of Exodus, but I haven't watched them. So anyway,
train wreck.
All right. So our new question, Qwerty says, Dr. Falk, when you talk about the liminal inertia, would this be justification or purification rituals for the Israelites? And if it is it inherited from the Egyptians or is it a reaction?
Yes.
Yes. Just
yes. It's both. It's both an inheritance and a reaction. Okay. And that's because we find many of the same rituals used in Israelite temple purification ritual that we do find in, say, Egyptian temple ritual. Okay. Probably the only thing that the Israelites don't do that the Egyptians do is wash out their mouths with natron. And it's probably because they don't have a ready supply of natron. But they're shaving, their ritual of bathing, and they're putting on clean garments. Mm. So that's sort of the only other thing that you'd find in, say, Egyptian priestly ritual would be the, as I said, the washing your mouth out with natron.
Yeah, and I found it interesting that you said in the book that the gods of the Egyptians, like they would feed them and then put them to bed every night. They had to put them to bed so they could sleep and stuff like that. And I was like, that's so funny. But anyway,
so that's the price of idolatry. That's the price of idolatry, is your God is now being cared for by human hands.
Yeah, so the last thing then, I guess, since I don't have any more questions, is I thought you had a good take on Joseph going into Egypt. And so we hear sometimes, because I'm having a guy on next week to talk about race in the Bible and things like that. And sometimes we hear from groups that, Jesus, and of course he fled into to Egypt, from Herod, because he was, everybody in Egypt's black and he's black, so he went there to blend in. And it doesn't seem that way from the hieroglyphs to me. What do you know? You had a good take on why the Egypt was a big point for Hebrews.
Yes, and that's because they had already established colonies there under during the Babylonian exile. What happens during the Babylonian captivity is Nebuchadnezzar installs his puppet governor Gedaliah to be governor over Judea. And the Israelites decide they don't want to do that. They don't want to bow the knee to Nebuchadnezzar. So they knock off Gedaliah. And then they run. And they run to Egypt. They first run to Pelusium. And then they run to Heliopolis. And then they run to Elephantine. And they just can't escape. Nebuchadnezzar goes all the way up to Elephantine and breaks skulls. Because he's angry. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he's angry, was a terrifying force.
Okay, I got you. So they already had colonies set up there.
They had colonies. They actually had temples, 2 temples.
Temples in Egypt.
In Egypt. One temple was at Elephantine, and there's actually a small fragment of that still remains. The other temple of Yahweh was at Tel Yehudiah near Heliopolis.
Gotcha.
And during, say, the life of Christ, that temple at Tel Yehudiah was still in operation.
Okay, so, yeah, I got you. So we did have another question come in. It says, sorry, I'm going to put it up here for you. But first, let me play you a quick.
Ancient Israelites are purportedly enslaved in Egypt. Now, we'll set aside the fact that archaeological studies can find no good evidence to support the idea that these two cultures ever coexisted, and it's not like shared words and languages. We can ignore some of the numbers that are presented in there, that during the Exodus there were over 600,000 men over the age of 20, which talks about a population of roughly 2 million people at a time when the entire population of Egypt was maybe 3 or 3.5 million people, and yet there aren't recordings of it. The Egyptians don't seem to have noticed, just like they didn't seem to notice the flood.
Okay. How do you want me to dissect this one?
Well, this guy asked, our next question was, how would you define evidence in your field? And since he said there's no evidence of them sharing culture, that they were there, that they were slaves, that they
first of all, he says there's no evidence of them exchanging culture or language. Well, that's already been proven wrong. I mean, that's wrong right out of the gate. I mean, we got lots of Egyptian loanwords, so they did swap at least some language. And they actually, the swap went both ways. We do find actually some Canaanite words, Semitic words, in Egypt, like edut, that comes into the reign of Ramses III. We also have yams for sea. That's the Semitic word for sea, as in a large body of water. So that's not true right out of the gate. Okay. The second thing is that there is this myth that sort of prevails, say, atheism, that we have all these massive records from Egypt. Well, the fact is we actually have very, very few records. What we have is a lot of religious texts, religious inscriptions. Those are highly cleaned up because what they are is religious texts are offerings to the gods. The last thing you want to do is present your failures to the gods. That's generally a bad thing in any religion. You don't present as an offering to your gods your biggest failures. Just like you don't present the spotted lamb to Yahweh. So this idea that we have all these records of Egypt. The fact is, of all the reigns of all the kings of Egypt, we only have the court records of one 15-year segment of history and only partial records. And that's from the Amarna period. Because we find a scriptorium at Amarna that has all these diplomatic correspondence written on clay tablets, written in Akkadian. But we don't have, say, the Egyptian counterparts to those tablets, the papyrus. They're all lost. So if you have an Exodus, where are you going to find those records if they had written them down? You'd find them at a scriptorium at Paramses on papyrus. Paramses is very wet. You're not going to find any papyrus there.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
In fact, the preservation of documents is so bad in the Nile Delta that we've only found about 24 documents from the entire delta. Almost all the documents we find are from Upper Egypt. And again, none of them come from a scriptorium. None of them come from the royal court. So,
Okay.
he's patently wrong here that we're going to find lots, because it's just the archaeological record is not preserved in that way. It's just silly. And now, as far as the counts of Israelites, now that's one of the most controversial topics inside of biblical studies. Everyone's got an opinion on this. And you got people saying, biblical scholars that believe in an Exodus, and even early daters, who will say, well, we can't take those numbers literally.
Right.
We can take the 480 literally, but we can't take the numbers of Exodus literally, of the numbers literally. Bryant Wood is an example of this. He takes that 480 years literally, but he doesn't take the numbers of the census literally.
Right.
So he's picking and choosing here, but
Sure.
he's not alone here. A lot of biblical scholars, in fact, most biblical scholars will say that the amount of people that left during the Exodus is in the 5 figures, between 10 and 50,000.
Gotcha.
Now, I tend to lean more towards in the low to mid 6 figures. But I'm approaching this from differently. I'm not looking at, say, the text here. I'm looking at the archaeology and the demographics of the region. The city of Avarus was a big city. It was 250 hectares. And if you look at, say, a similar, say, Semitic settlement like Lehun, where the demographics are very well known, you discover that you have about 800 people per hectare there. So that's the population density at Lehun. So if you apply that same sort of population density to Avarus, you do get something in the low 6 figures. And plus, they're also going through Paramses, not Pi Ramses, sorry, Pithom and Sukkot, where they're picking up additional Semitic populations. So by the time they actually leave, I think they're in the six figures.
Gotcha. Okay. So in response to his question about defining evidence in your field, you would say that, as you know, when you're not talking as a biblical scholar, you're talking as a historian, you would say like there are direct and indirect types of evidence.
Yeah, there's direct and indirect types of evidence. In fact, most of ancient history is based upon indirect evidence. This is one of the advantages modern historians have. They got the luxury of direct evidence. In the case of ancient history, you're much more dependent upon building inductive cases and indirect evidence. And if you get into prehistoric history, then you're starting to get into abductive cases.
Right. Best explanation.
So the more back in time you go, sort of the lower the standard of evidence becomes, because the evidence is just not available. If you're to do any meaningful work at all, you have to lower that standard of evidence. But this idea of inductive evidence being used in ancient history is across the board. Doesn't matter which field of ancient history it is.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I heard you give the example once of the seafaring people. Like
Mm-hmm.
we would say we know that the seafaring people did these things in history, but we only have indirect evidence of them through like correspondences.
Yeah.
For example. Okay, so that's for the questioner. And sorry, we had one last question come in, and I'll let you go. Sorry, thanks for being here with us so long. Actually, it's really
I enjoyed
appreciate
this.
your time. Yeah, we really appreciate your time, honestly, because I mean, you know, a lot of us, you could email your family member and you get a response back from you quicker, and you're a scholar, and I'm like, geez. So it's so funny. You know, I email a friend.
Well, they're not getting quick responses from me this week. I am snowed this week.
Yeah, you've been getting a lot of you've been buzzing a lot right now for sure. So this is our last question from Iron Charioteer. Says, Converse, can you ask Dr. Falk what can you tell about the Amarna period and the influence on future cultures? Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, I think he's asking what can I tell them about the Amarna period and its influence on future cultures.
Sure.
And I think he's talking here about Atonism.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. Now, a lot of people have suggested that Atonism is the first form of monotheism. The first extant form of monotheism. I disagree with that. Okay. I don't think Atonism was monotheistic. Now, I know I am going against a lot of, say, my colleagues in this regard, but I think the textual evidence points more that Atonism was actually pantheistic. It believed that the Aten was in everything. You're a manifestation of the Aten. I'm a manifestation of the Aten. The king is the highest manifestation of the Aten. Everything was breathed into being by Aten and is sustained by the Aten. All is the Aten. Okay, that's pantheism. That's not monotheism. But what this does is this sets the stage for monotheism. Because what happens in monotheism is you get a different definition of divinity. So what happens is the laws that are given at Mount Sinai present a different idea of God. A God that's not immanent, but a God that's transcendent. And what happens is once you make God transcendent, pantheism collapses into monotheism. So in order for you to get to monotheism, you have to have circulating in the culture both pantheism, henotheism, you know, a little localism, all these things that were already in the culture set the stage for that monotheistic collapse. And then the whole sort of religious structure settles into the lowest energy state.
That's yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I see what you're saying there, and that's I like that you clarified that. I didn't know that much about Itonism, but I know that you've mentioned it, and I've watched a lot of your content, so I'm getting super familiar. But still a non-specialist, and that's why I feel like IP is a did such a great job, because the specialist is always going to notice things the non-specialist doesn't, right? Because like I have a job, like I run a laboratory, so I'm not going to be able to, although I can listen to lectures and stuff all day while I'm doing my job, I'm not actually doing that as my job. So there are going to be things I miss as a non-specialist that a specialist can definitely correct. So with that being said, I really appreciate you being here. You guys, I'm going to be having next Wednesday Dr. Vince Bantu on to talk about, is Christianity a white man's religion? And then on the May 22nd, we'll have Kurt McGregor coming on to discuss the complexities of Molinism and some of we'll be talking about Calvinism and Arminianism as well, but we're just going to be getting into the brass tacks of like Molinism from the guy who literally wrote the book on Molinism. If you're not familiar, he one of William Lane Craig's students, but he actually wrote Luis de Molina's book. And then in June, Michael Heiser will be on. So those should be fun, and I'm looking forward to those. But I really appreciate you coming on and taking your time. I know that you're a busy guy, so thanks so much for that.
Well, thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks everybody else for being in the live chat and keeping it professional there. So you guys have a great night.